If you've been following the news at all over the last few days, I'm sure by now you've heard that the United States Coast Guard has confirmed that the Titan submersible that was carrying 5 men down to the floor of the Atlantic to view the wreckage of the Titanic has been lost with all hands on board. Apparently, there was a catastrophic implosion event about halfway through the descent, and the Coast Guard has positively identified wreckage from the submersible about 1,600 feet from where the bow of the Titanic now rests on the ocean floor. So, in a way, this is the best way that the situation could end if the men were not going to be recovered. Many of us were thinking over the last couple of days that these guys could have gotten tangled up in the wreckage of the Titanic somehow, or just plummeted to the ocean floor and be sitting there not able to return. And you can imagine what it would be like to be trapped just in that steel cylinder with darkness and cold, probably little to no food or water on board, no way to communicate with anybody, no way to talk to your loved ones to even say goodbye. You're just watching the time tick by and knowing that your oxygen is getting lower and lower. And these guys were adventurers. They were experienced adventurers, thrill seeker types, if you want to call them that. They would have known that there has never been a rescue even attempted from that kind of depth before, so the chances of them making it back to the surface were pretty close to zero. And that would just be a horrible way to go, just a nightmarish way to die, trapped like that, and just waiting for the end. So if you're going to not make it back, this is about the best case scenario. This is how I would want to go personally myself, just in milliseconds, and the guy's probably not even knowing what happened to them. What I wanted to talk to you about, though, is the reaction that I'm seeing on social media to what's happened here. I'm seeing this, others I know are seeing this, and we're dismayed by it. There are people that over the last few days have been making fun of these men, just kind of acting like they're hosting Saturday Night Live and trying to outdo each other on various witty comments that they can make and ways that they can find to make fun of these men, to make fun of the situation, making jokes about men that, for all we knew, were trapped and headed for a terrible death. And I found that personally very disturbing. I know many other people did as well. And it's just a terrible thing about the state of the conversation in our modern world. It's regrettable. And you've got people making the jokes, and then you've got some people coming back at them saying, look, that's sick. How can you possibly joke about something like this? This is a tragedy. And the responses that I was seeing come back generally fell in a couple of categories. First of all, people were saying, look, these guys were stupid. This was an experimental submersible. They had, what was it, a PlayStation console type controller that was being used to manipulate the craft. The guy who designed it obviously wasn't very concerned with safety from his own remarks. They even fired someone from the company for complaining about safety related issues to the submersible. So, and these guys, they're just going to go down in something like this and take their chance. Well, then they deserve what they get. So you can see that out there. And then there's other people saying, look, a bunch of rich white guys got into this thing and spent $250,000 each to have this experience, this thrill-seeking experience, while there are people out there that lack basic necessities. They basically deserve what they get. And I've just been seeing this kind of thing floating back and forth, and in response to people when they say, why are you making fun of these guys? That's generally what you get. And then some other people this afternoon I saw, in response to what I and some others had posted online, they were saying things like, well, you know, a few days ago there were some immigrants trying to make their way to Italy and their boat capsized and they all drowned. You don't hear anything about that. Why don't you hear anything about that? Well, it's because they weren't white and they weren't rich. I mean, everything these days seems to boil down to race and class warfare. That's just all certain people seem to be able to talk about. And the tragedy here just goes overlooked. Now, just a couple of comments on this just to stimulate some thinking. I understand some of the points that are being made out there. I understand when people say, look, this was a dumb thing for these guys to do in terms of going down in an experimental vessel like this with so many warnings that they had been given, with obviously the company president, the designer of the vehicle, not being very concerned with safety. The whole thing just looks ad hoc, not advisable. There's even one guy that's been interviewed in the media who pulled out of the expedition because of concerns like that and asked for a refund. Now, I can understand that. And we can have a conversation about that, a profitable conversation about that. And already people are saying, what should we do to prevent this kind of thing from happening in the future? This is a tragedy. That's a positive way to bring something out of this. That's a productive kind of conversation to have. And yeah, you could look at it as maybe the men were foolish. Certainly the designer of the submersible who knew the situation best. I mean, at least he wasn't a hypocrite. He went down multiple times himself, and now he's amongst those who've lost their lives. In looking at that, though, one little word of caution that I will issue on this is, many people have dived to the Titanic now. They've taken this expedition. There have been many expeditions there and back. All have come back safely. There have been some close calls, but there has never been, to my knowledge, a tragedy like this when diving on a wreck. There have also been expeditions to the battleship Bismarck and other wrecks as well. Many of you may remember to James Cameron, who directed the Titanic movie. He designed and participated in building his own submersible, took it all the way down to the bottom of the Mariana Trench, which is much deeper than Titanic. It's 36,000 feet down to the bottom, whereas Titanic's at 12,500 feet. So we've had thus far an enviable record of successful ventures like this. So yeah, the guys knew there was risk involved in this kind of thing, but they probably didn't think it was that significant. There's been so many successful trips, people bringing back all kinds of spectacular footage. And yeah, many people are fascinated by the story of the Titanic and would really like to see it up close in person with their own eyes. So it's an opportunity. They didn't feel all that threatened. They took it. Unfortunately, technology has spoiled us a little bit, and a record of successful ventures like this has gotten a lot of people to maybe not appreciate the dangers associated with a dive down to that level where the pressure is like 6,000 pounds per square inch and can crush you, like just happened here. So they're not stupid people. Let's just put it that way. Yeah, they took what I think is an unwise risk, but there is all of that history and so many people that have done this, and the opportunity, it was compelling, and they just went for it. So, but we can have a discussion about these things. And then when it comes to other tragedies like the immigrants trying to reach Italy and all, you don't accomplish anything in terms of trying to bring some kind of attention to issues like that by mocking people in this other situation. Again, for the last few days, before it was recognized that an implosion had destroyed this craft, we were thinking it was possible that these guys were down on the bottom of the ocean floor, trapped and facing a horrible death. And you got people making jokes about it and hating on them and all that sort of thing. It doesn't do anything to bring attention to causes that you think are at least equally as worthy. When you act like that, when you do this kind of thing, you just hate and mock. And again, we're bringing the race issue into it. People are just going to do that. That's just the thing to do these days. But it doesn't take us any closer to having a productive conversation about any of these issues. It just detracts from it. It just makes people not want to listen to you, want to tune you out, thinking you're just not serious and you're not somebody that they can have a conversation with. If you're going to treat somebody like that, if you can't show basic human empathy for somebody in a terrible situation just because of their race or how much money they happen to have. I mean, what difference does any of that make? Can we not relate to one another on a basic human level? Can we not take a minute to put ourselves in the shoes of somebody facing that kind of a fate and empathize with them and think this is a terrible thing? What impels us to want to mock, to want to make fun, to want to just say, well, screw them, they get what they deserve, they're rich white guys, to hell with them. That's the mentality that I've been seeing out there in certain quarters, and it's very disturbing to me. And again, certain people are like, well, this is what the rich do. They've got all this money, and they could be doing better things in the world, but they're spending $250,000 a ticket to go and do something like totally self-indulgent like this. First of all, if you're going to make that kind of objection, then really the criticism comes back on you as well. I mean, all of us, no matter what financial condition you're in, could probably stand to do more with what we have when it comes to making the world a better place. So standing back, pointing out what somebody else is not doing is not by itself going to change anything. All of us are going to have to roll up our sleeves and get busy and do what we personally can with the means that we have, if the world is going to change, rather than waiting on people who have the deep pockets to do everything for us. It's not working out so far, so we should really try something different. Get everyone involved in trying to make the world a better place instead of just hating on people with money. So that's part of it. Again, you have to understand too, these guys, as some other people were saying, they go out on an expedition like this. Now look how many people whose lives they've put in danger, and they didn't care about that. So why should we care about them? First of all, again, that record of successful dives to sites like this, they probably didn't really think the odds of anything going wrong were that high. They expected to go down, come back, everything was going to be fine. They never intended to put anybody else in harm's way, okay? So this is not just a bunch of rich snobs making everybody heel for them. It's just not that kind of situation. On another front, why has the news story been covered so much? Is it because they're rich white guys as opposed to the immigrants who were trying to make it to Italy? There are a few different things that play into this. First of all, the Titanic has been a subject of public fascination ever since she sank. I grew up fascinated with it. I'm 50 years old now. I read what I could get my hands on, like Walter Lord's book, A Night to Remember. I remember very well in 1985 when the wreck was finally discovered and how exciting that was and how much I wished I could be with those explorers finding this ship that was a legend by then. I remember that very well. And people are fascinated with the Titanic and with its history. And many people feel like going down on something like this, an expedition like this, is actually paying a tribute to it. It's not only seeing history with their own eyes, but more or less paying tribute to the people who lost their lives on that site. I mean, there's more than one way to look at this. Other people think it should be left alone as a graveyard, what have you. So we can have a conversation on these things, and we can agree to disagree on these things without hating on each other, without casting dispersions and making fun, I think, or at least we should be able to. The other aspect of it, too, is this is an exotic type of situation. You've got these guys going down, doing something that's risky. It captures the imagination, just like when astronauts go into space, when the Apollo program went to the moon. It was all incredibly risky, and it fired the imagination. This is what presses people to innovate, to do creative things, and to push the advance of society. We never would have gotten where we are today without people willing to take risks and to push the envelope, as it were, to move out into the unexplored frontiers. So whether you think it's foolish or not, and in this case, it is undeniably to a certain degree foolish because of the lack of safety precautions that were taken. They could have done this in a much safer manner, I think. But still, there's that exotic element to it that captures the public's attention. Also, again, think for a minute about what could have happened here. These guys, rather than imploding and dying quickly, they could have been stranded on the ocean floor, stranded in the wreck of the Titanic itself, facing a slow, agonizing death. And there's a certain amount of morbid fascination with that and just an outpouring of empathy. People say, wow, I wouldn't want to be in that situation. That would be a nightmare. And they're going to keep up with the story when they see it in the media. So there's all of that to it too. There's all of these nuances to the story. It's not just about, oh, some rich white guys are missing, so now we all have to stay glued to our television sets. It's a lot more than that. So let's not go in that direction first. And when it comes to people who are hating on billionaires and people that have more money, and, all of us, have seen people with a lot of money spending it in ways that we don't approve of. I see somebody throw a $2 million wedding, and I think, what? The $1 million wedding wasn't sufficient. My wedding, I think, cost $2,000. So to me, it seems excessive, but I don't travel in that world, and it's not up to me to prioritize for other people. So we could maybe say all kinds of things about what could better be done with the money that people would spend on doing something like this. But should we really let that detract from our empathy for people in a situation like this? I've known a lot of poor people. They didn't have a whole lot to their name, but they were good, humane people. And in this case, they were caring people. In this case, they would have felt really badly for these guys. They wouldn't have hated them just because they had more money. And it doesn't make sense to think that way. You see, there is something a lot worse than financial poverty. And that's a poverty of the human spirit. When we lose the ability to empathize with someone in a situation like this, simply because they're not uh, in our social class, they've got more money than we do, or they're rich white guys, that kind of thing, for whatever reason, you can't see past certain labels and certain categorizations. You can't feel for other human beings for a minute. You can't just see them as human beings in jeopardy, people who need help, however they got into the circumstances and what you might think of them personally and their life choices. You know, many times in the past, I've seen gay people treated this way when they had AIDS. And you would see some more conservative type people saying, well, they shouldn't have acted that way. You know, they shouldn't have engaged in that kind of a lifestyle. They ended up just reaping what they've sown here. And that's all they would offer by way of commentary. They couldn't just show empathy and love for people suffering. However they got into it. Yes, let's talk about these things. Let's talk about safety. Let's talk about whether we should be doing these things. Let's talk about how it might have been done differently. Let's talk about other tragedies that maybe are not getting as much attention. But let's not make it something it isn't, because we have some sort of prejudice towards certain people to the extent rather, that we can no longer see them as human. This is one of the worst aspects of our polarized society today. We've gotten to the point where we dehumanize people in certain categories that we have a problem with for some reason. A Democrat will look at a Republican and treat them not like a person who has different ideas, but as a force of evil. And there are Republicans who view Democrats that way. There are people on all sides of all kinds of issues who just can no longer see the opposition as human anymore. You're Hitler, you're Stalin, you're a force of evil, you have to be stamped out, you have to be suppressed, whatever. We have dehumanized one another. And it's one of the reasons that we are suffering so much in our discourse, and we are at one another's throats. And this, I'm afraid, is a perfect example of that, and extremely regrettable. So you may be, for whatever reason, hateful, envious, whatever, toward people who have more money. But if you can't show them basic empathy when they're in a situation like this, as far as I'm concerned, you have impoverished yourself in a way that is far worse than any kind of financial deprivation you could suffer, because you have eroded your own essential humanity. And I think that is an even greater tragedy than what's just happened here. Because without that empathy, without that ability to look at one another and see one another in those human terms, how can we ever have a conversation with each other? How can we ever resolve our differences? How can we ever move forward? Anyway, there endeth the rant, as they say. I just wanted to bring some of these thoughts out for discussion. I find this perhaps to be an even greater tragedy, this lack of empathy, a greater tragedy even than what's happened to these men. And I hope that we, if we learn anything from this, will learn that we have a real dark side in ourselves that we need to do something about. We really need to do some soul searching. Because if we're forming a society where it's okay to make fun of someone else's tragedy, or to even wish it on a category of people that we just don't like for whatever reason, then quite frankly, we're in the midst of creating a soulless society. And that would be a much greater tragedy than what happened to the men on the Titan.